The moment before you speak, the verdict is already in, not forming. In. Neurologists at Princeton measured exactly how long it takes the human brain to generate a confident social evaluation of another person. 39 milliseconds. Not 7 seconds. 39 milliseconds, the span of half a blink. In that verdict, assembled entirely from visual data before a single word is exchanged, carries a documented cognitive bias that the brain will spend the next several minutes, sometimes hours, quietly enforcing. Machiavelli wrote in The Prince that men judge far more by their eyes than by their hands. He wasn't being poetic. He was describing the foundational operating system of human social cognition. There exists a category of person who understands this at a mechanical level, who has treated their physical presentation not as an accessory to their power, but as the weapon itself, who has become so obsessively, so precisely, so deliberately calibrated in what they project that the room adjusts before they've said a word. But appearance is only the entry point. Beneath it runs something colder, something more dangerous, a psychological architecture that makes certain men untouchable. Not untouchable because they are liked. Untouchable because the cost of disrespecting them has been made, through precise engineering, too high to calculate. By the end of this, you will understand exactly how that architecture is built, and you will understand why Machiavelli considered the management of perception not a vanity, but a survival imperative. Before you open your mouth, the case is already closed. Let's start with the mechanism. Cold, clinical, without the sentimentality that makes this truth comfortable to ignore. Your brain processes faces through two distinct pathways running simultaneously at radically different speeds. The fast pathway, the subcortical route, moves visual information through the amygdala and produces an emotional and social evaluation before the visual cortex has finished fully rendering the image. You're not experiencing intuition in those early moments. You are experiencing biology. The verdict produced there is automatic, unconscious, and stubbornly resistant to revision. Social psychologists Nalini Ambady and Robert Rosenthal designed what became known as the thin slicing experiments at Harvard in the 1990s. Subjects were shown silent video clips of university teachers, 30 seconds, then 10 seconds, then 6. They rated the teachers on competence, effectiveness, warmth. The evaluations from 6 seconds of silent footage correlated almost perfectly with ratings given by students who had attended those teachers' full semester courses. 300 hours of interaction did not meaningfully improve on 6 seconds of visual impression. Read that slowly. The information contained in your appearance, your posture, your grooming, the way your body occupies space. That information is not a supplement to the impression you make. It is the impression. Everything that comes after, the handshake, the introduction, the well-constructed argument, is processed through a neural filter that already has its answer. That filter will find evidence to support it, and quietly discard evidence that contradicts it. This is called confirmatory processing. Once the initial impression fires, the brain behaves less like an evaluator and more like a defense attorney for its own original verdict. Walk in precisely calibrated, composed, deliberate, visually coherent, and the brain across from you flags your average moments as confirmation of your strength. Walk in collapsed, rushed, visually scattered, and that same brain flags your brilliant moments as suspicious and your ordinary failures as damning. You are not being evaluated. You are being filtered through a decision that was made before you arrived. This is the first layer of the architecture that men who are never disrespected understand. Not as philosophy, as engineering. The Princeton study, the Harvard thin slices, the subcortical verdict, these are not academic curiosities. They're the technical specifications of a system you're being evaluated by whether you study it or not. The only question is whether you are designing your signal consciously or leaving it to chance. Machiavelli watched princes lose their thrones not because they were weak, but because they appeared weak. The distinction mattered enormously to him. Reality, he wrote, is far less important than the appearance of reality, because the appearance of reality is what people act on. Men will follow a leader who appears certain before they will follow one who is certain. This is not cynicism. It is neuroscience 400 years before neuroscience had a name. The question Machiavelli was really asking, and the question this video will answer, is not how do you become powerful. It is how do you become unignorable. Because power without signal is invisible. And invisible power does not command respect. It invites testing. The man who is never disrespected has solved this problem. And the solution begins not with strength, but with the precise, deliberate management of what he projects before a word leaves his mouth. Your appearance isn't how you look. It's the sentence the room reads about you before you speak. Here is something most people get wrong about Machiavelli. They read The Prince as a manual for cruelty. Machiavelli had watched the most powerful men in Renaissance Italy succeed and fail, rise and collapse, command loyalty and lose it, and he had noticed something that the historians around him had missed. The decisive variable was rarely capability. It was signal. The capable men who collapsed had one thing in common. They had allowed their signal to contradict their strength. They had hesitated publicly. They had accepted small indignities. They had displayed uncertainty in moments when certainty was the currency being traded. And those micro-signals, each one apparently minor, had accumulated into a narrative the room had constructed about them. A narrative that, once built, could not be dismantled by any single act of competence. Signal accumulates. That is the first principle of the Machiavellian system. Research by Michael Krauss and Dr. Keltner at UC Berkeley in 2009 demonstrated something Machiavelli would have recognized immediately. They studied social hierarchies forming in real time, new groups of strangers interacting, and found that dominance rankings became stable within 4 minutes. For minutes, not 4 months, not 4 hours, for minutes of behavioral observation, and the group had established, without discussion, without explicit negotiation, who the high-status individuals were. What created that ranking? Not credentials, not stated accomplishments. The behavioral signals, eye contact duration, vocal certainty, spatial occupation, the absence of self-interruption. The high-status individuals in those groups shared one defining characteristic. They behaved as though the social verdict was already settled. And because they behaved that way, it was. Julius Caesar understood this with the intuition of a man born into political survival. His physical presentation was a studied performance. The laurel wreath he wore constantly was not vanity. It was architecture. It solved a specific problem. Caesar was going bald at a time when physical perfection was inseparable from the Roman concept of leadership authority. The wreath made that vulnerability invisible. Simultaneously, his clothing, his movement through spaces, his way of making men feel seen when he spoke to them, all of it was calibrated, deliberately, obsessively. He wore the purple stripe of equestrian rank with the border of a senator before he had the rank to justify it. He was projecting destination, not current position. He was engineering the signal before the substance had fully arrived. This is the Machiavellian signal system operating at full power. You project the status level you are claiming, not the one you have been assigned. The brain across from you, running its 39-millisecond evaluation, building its confirmatory architecture, reads the signal and constructs a verdict. The verdict generates behavior. The behavior becomes the reality. There's a word for what happens when a man fails to manage this system. That word is testing. When signal is absent, when a man's bearing does not communicate stable authority, when his presence does not emit the subtle markers of settled dominance, the social environment fills that vacuum. It fills it with tests. Small ones first. A dismissive comment, a slight interruption, an instruction given and then quietly not followed. Each test is calibrated to the signal deficiency it detected. Each one is a question. Is this a man whose boundaries carry consequence? And each one that goes without a decisive response answers that question in the negative. This is not abstract. This is biological. The social brain is a hierarchy detection engine. It is always scanning, always looking for status cues, always running a background process that maps dominance relationships in every group you enter. When your signal is strong, That engine reads you and files you. When your signal is weak or absent, that engine classifies you as a resource to be tested, categorized, and ultimately positioned below the individuals whose signal it has already filed. Machiavelli didn't teach men to be powerful. He taught them to become unignorable. And the difference between those two things is the difference between a man the room respects and a man the room tests until it finds the boundary. Here is where it gets uncomfortable. The signal system has no mercy for good intentions. It doesn't reward work ethic. It doesn't compensate for internal certainty that is not externally visible. The room cannot read your private confidence. It can only read what you project. And what you project consistently in every interaction in the spaces between your words as much as in the words themselves determines the social position the room assigns you. Not the position you deserve, the position your signal claims. Machiavelli didn't teach men to be powerful. He taught them to become unignorable. And unignorable is a construction, not a gift. There's a moment most people have experienced and almost nobody has correctly diagnosed. Someone dismisses you in a meeting. A colleague speaks over you. A person you trusted takes credit for your work in front of others. Someone tests your boundary and you say nothing. In the seconds that follow, you feel something that is difficult to name precisely, a tightening, a flush of heat, a sudden interior noise that crowds out clear thinking. You have been told your whole life that this feeling is ego, that the emotionally mature response is to let it go, that small men fight for dignity while large men rise above it. That framing is not wisdom. It is the most effective way ever devised to train men to accept their own systematic diminishment. Naomi Eisenberger at UCLA demonstrated this in a landmark 2003 study using fMRI imaging during a virtual ball-tossing game where subjects were socially excluded. The neural signature was identical to the signature of physical injury. The brain does not distinguish meaningfully between a punch and a public dismissal. Both register as threat. Both demand a response. But here is what nobody tells you about what happens next. When you absorb that signal, when you register the disrespect neurologically and then produce no decisive external response, your brain does not conclude that you have risen above it. It concludes that you have accepted it. The cortisol spike that followed the disrespect lingers. The status encoding system, the neural architecture that tracks your relative position in social hierarchies, updates downward, not because the other person is stronger than you, but because you behaved as though they were. Your own neurology files the result of that interaction as a data point about your position in the hierarchy, and it influences how you enter the next interaction, and the one after that. This is not philosophy. This is documented biology. Social defeat, the behavioral and neurological pattern of consistently absorbing dominance challenges without response, has measurable downstream effects on serotonin regulation, dopamine sensitivity, and the way the prefrontal cortex governs future social behavior. The person who disrespected you also has a brain running a hierarchy detection process. When they tested you with the dismissal, the interruption, the subtle diminishment, they were running a calibration. What they received in response was not your silence. What they received was confirmation. The test produced its answer. This man's boundaries carry no consequence. File him accordingly. And the filing is not temporary. Social status encoding in the brain is long-term potentiation, the same mechanism that makes learning stick. A single uncontested act of disrespect does not ruin you, but plants a neural flag in the other person's social map, a flag that says, test here, low resistance, low consequence. The next test arrives sooner. It goes slightly further. Augustus Caesar understood this with the ruthless clarity of a man who had watched his adoptive father, Julius Caesar, be assassinated in part because he had allowed small challenges to accumulate into a cultural permission structure. When Augustus assumed power, his response to the first public act of disrespect directed at his authority was not proportional. It was terminal, not out of cruelty, out of architecture. He was not punishing one man. He was recalibrating every other man watching. He was establishing, through one decisive and disproportionate response, the cost function that would govern all future calculations about whether to challenge him. His reign lasted 40 years. The lesson is not that Augustus was brutal. The lesson is that he understood the mathematics of respect. He understood that the first disrespect you absorb becomes the operating manual others use on you indefinitely. Most people make a critical error in how they think about this. They believe respect is something you earn over time, that the accumulated record of your competence, your reliability, your character eventually produces a surplus of dignity that protects you from disrespect. This belief is neurologically incorrect. Respect is not a savings account. It is a live signal. It is reevaluated in every interaction based on the behavioral data that interaction contains. A man with 30 years of sterling reputation who absorbs a public dismissal without decisive response just taught everyone in the room something new about him. And what they learned overwrites a significant portion of what they thought they knew. Reputation is written in ink. Status is written in pencil. And it is rewritten every time you enter a room. The man who is never disrespected does not have better luck. He does not occupy a social position that shields him from testing. He has engineered, through consistent and deliberate behavioral signals across hundreds of interactions, a cost function so reliably high that the social brain of the person across from him performs an automatic calculation and reaches a conclusion before the test is even consciously considered. Not worth it. The first disrespect you accept becomes the operating manual others use on you forever. Now we get to the part that most people misunderstand so completely that they spend years moving in exactly the wrong direction. The man who is never disrespected is not, as a general profile, the loudest man in the room. He is not the most physically imposing. He is not the most verbally aggressive. He does not carry himself with the visible tension of a man constantly prepared for conflict. He does not posture. He does not broadcast warnings. He does not fill silences with demonstrations of his capability. He does something far more disturbing. He is still. Research by Larissa Tydens and Alison Fergale at Stanford in 2003 documented what they called the complementarity effect in status signaling. High-status individuals, those consistently perceived as dominant and authoritative by their social environment, displayed measurably lower physiological and behavioral reactivity to social challenges than low-status individuals. They did not respond faster. They did not respond louder. They responded less, and they were perceived as higher status because of it. The mechanism is this. Emotional reactivity in response to a social challenge is a dominant signal, but it signals the wrong direction. When you react visibly to a provocation, you are communicating that the provocation has reached you, that it has penetrated your perimeter, that you registered it as a threat significant enough to require an immediate response. The other person's action has produced a visible effect on your internal state. That visible effect is the signal. And the signal reads, "You have leverage over me." The man who is never disrespected has developed what psychologists call cold regulation, the capacity to receive a social challenge, process it internally with full clarity, and produce zero uncontrolled external signal in the moment of reception. Not because he doesn't feel it. He feels it precisely. He registers the nature of the challenge, its source, its intent, its magnitude. And then he does nothing with that registration that he has not chosen to do. This is not suppression. Suppression, the active effort to push down an emotional response, is metabolically expensive and neurologically detectable. His threat detection system has been recalibrated to distinguish between genuine danger and social testing. And social testing, to this man, is not a threat. It is information. This is why the untouchable man appears, to the casual observer, to be almost supernaturally calm. It is not performance. It is infrastructure. Machiavelli articulated this dynamic in his discussion of the lion and the fox, perhaps the most misread passage in The Prince. Most readers take it as a simple instruction. Be fierce when necessary. Be cunning when necessary. What Machiavelli was actually describing was a psychological disposition. The lion that only knows force is predictable, and predictability is vulnerability. The fox that only knows cunning is perceived as weak, and perceived weakness invites force. The prince who has mastered both has created something that neither the lion nor the fox possesses alone. Unpredictability. The man who sometimes reacts and sometimes does not, whose response to a given provocation cannot be accurately predicted in advance, is the most costly man to test. Because the testing agent cannot calculate the risk. They cannot model the response function. They do not know whether the next test will produce silence, a measured response, or something they did not anticipate. That uncertainty is not an accident. It is engineered. The dangerous man does not telegraph. He does not warn. An invisible capability, Machiavelli understood, is more powerful than displayed capability. Because displayed capability invites challenge, it becomes a target. Invisible capability generates something more valuable than fear. It generates doubt. Doubt, in the social hierarchy detection system, is the most paralyzing signal of all. Certainty, even negative certainty, the certainty that challenging someone will produce a predictable response, allows the social brain to make a decision. Doubt prevents decision. It freezes the calculation. And while the other person's social brain is frozen in that calculation, while they are running their risk assessment on an unreadable signal, the untouchable man has already moved. He has not moved visibly. He may not have moved at all in the external sense, but he has filed the information. He has assessed the source. He has determined his response timeline, and he will execute that response not in the heat of the moment, not in the emotional window the other person opened expecting to find him reactive and exposed, but on his own schedule, in the form he chooses, at a cost the other person did not anticipate and cannot easily respond to. This is the lion and the fox operating simultaneously, because the cost-benefit calculation that every social brain runs automatically, the unconscious evaluation of whether to test, challenge, or diminish this person, consistently returns the same answer. The probability of a controlled, predictable, low-consequence outcome is too low. The man's response function is unreadable. The potential cost is unknown. And unknown costs, to a risk-averse social brain, function as infinite costs. He has not demanded respect. He has made disrespect economically irrational. They don't protect their dignity by fighting for it. They protect it by making the cost of challenging it too high to calculate. There is a story about John D. Rockefeller that his biographers documented and that he himself enjoyed telling. An irate contractor burst into his office one afternoon. A business dispute. The man had come in loud, agitated, ready to unload everything he had been building up for however many days it had taken him to decide to walk through that door. He laid into Rockefeller with the full weight of his anger. Rockefeller sat with his back turned. He was hunched over a writing desk, and he stayed there, not moving, not turning, not acknowledging, until the tirade ran its full course. Until the contractor had said everything he came to say. Until the room had gone quiet. Then Rockefeller spun slowly around in his swivel chair, looked at the man across from him, and asked, calmly, without a trace of the preceding 10 minutes anywhere on his face, "I didn't catch what you were saying. Would you mind repeating that?" The contractor didn't repeat it. That story is not about Rockefeller being indifferent. He was not indifferent. He was operating a three-phase system that he had refined across decades of navigating the most hostile business environment in American history. And that system, when you understand it mechanically, is the most powerful psychological tool available to a man who refuses to accept disrespect. Phase 1. The register. When the disrespect arrives, when the contractor walks through the door, when the dismissal lands in the meeting, when the boundary is tested, the man who converts disrespect into leverage does not react externally. He registers, coldly, precisely, without performance. He notes the nature of the challenge, its source, its intent, its magnitude, and its audience. He files everything. His external signal in that moment is zero, not suppressed. His colleagues described him as virtually immune to intimidation. He answered hostile interrogators with a slow, cool, measured quality that made their pressure seem to dissolve on contact. Not because he felt nothing, because he had developed the capacity to receive a social challenge and hold it completely without leaking it, until he chose what to do with it. The social brain of the person challenging him did something in response to that zero-signal reception. It lost its footing. Aggression directed at someone who doesn't flinch doesn't have anywhere to land. The energy of a challenge, when it meets no resistance, no reciprocation, no visible effect, produces something specific in the challenger's own nervous system. Doubt, then recalibration, then the slow, uncomfortable recognition that they may have misjudged the situation more significantly than they realized. Phase 2. The delay. The man who converts disrespect into leverage does not respond in the emotional window that the other person opened for him. He does not meet the challenge on the challenger's schedule. He does not respond when they expect it, in the form they anticipated, at the intensity they prepare to counter for. He responds on his own timeline. This delay is not passivity. It is information collection and response architecture. During the delay, the other person exists in a state of psychological uncertainty that is more costly to them than any immediate confrontation would have been. They don't know if you noticed. They don't know if you're planning something. They don't know if the disrespect even registered. That uncertainty is metabolically expensive. It occupies cognitive space. Research on anticipatory anxiety consistently shows that the period of waiting for a consequence is neurologically more activating than the consequence itself. The man who delays his response is not absorbing the disrespect. He is compounding interest on it. Rockefeller's silence in negotiations was documented across multiple accounts as his primary weapon. His biographers recorded that his long silences during deal negotiations threw the other party into self-defeating knots. They would begin to fill the silence. They would offer concessions he hadn't asked for. They would reveal positions they hadn't intended to reveal. They were responding to the pressure of his non-response, and he had said nothing. Phase 3. When the response comes, and it comes, always, eventually, it arrives in a form the other person didn't anticipate, on a timeline they had stopped expecting, at a magnitude they had not calculated for. The asymmetric response is not proportional. That is its entire point. A proportional response, insult met with insult, slight met with slight, resets the exchange to zero. It closes the ledger without interest. The asymmetric response does something different. It arrives later, in a different domain, at a cost the other person cannot easily neutralize, and without the emotional charge they expected to use as leverage against you. Rockefeller didn't fight his competitors loudly and visibly. He responded to business challenges not with equal force, but with architectural force, by changing the terrain. When a railroad tried to squeeze him for rates, he didn't protest publicly. He built a pipeline. The response was asymmetric, delayed, and arrived in a form they had no prepared answer for. Machiavelli wrote that a prince should never strike unless he can strike decisively. The man who swings and misses, he wrote, has paid twice, once in resources, once in perceived weakness. The asymmetric response is the application of this principle to daily social life. You do not respond to every provocation. You wait, you file, and when you do respond, you respond in a way that closes the question permanently, that recalibrates the cost function so dramatically that the person across from you does not forget the calculation they got wrong. This is what the men who are never disrespected understand, that the men who are constantly fighting don't. Constant fighting is a signal of constant testing. It means your perimeter is being probed regularly enough that you spend significant energy defending it. The untouchable man doesn't fight often because people don't often misjudge him, and the ones who do learn once. The dangerous man doesn't respond to disrespect. He files it. He is living in a fundamentally different situation. His respect is contingent. It has to be earned repeatedly. It can be withdrawn. It expires in new rooms, with new people, in high-pressure situations where his track record isn't visible. The man who commands permanent respect, who walks into rooms he has never entered and is extended deference before he has said a word, who has never had to fight for his dignity because the room never thought to challenge it. That man has built something structural, not situational. And the structure has 4 load-bearing pillars. The first pillar is scarcity of access. Psychological research on perceived value consistently demonstrates a principle that luxury markets have exploited for 2 centuries. Availability destroys value. What is universally accessible is universally discounted. The man who is available to everyone, who responds immediately to every message, who appears in every room he is invited to, who gives his time freely to whoever requests it, that man has trained his social environment to assign him the value of something abundant. The untouchable man is not accessible, not as a performance, not as a tactic, as a structural feature of who he is. His time is genuinely scarce because his standards for how it is spent are genuinely high. He doesn't create artificial unavailability. He has constructed a life in which his presence is a real cost to himself and therefore, necessarily, to anyone who wants it. When access to someone is scarce, the social brain does something automatic. It upgrades its valuation. It assumes that something this difficult to reach must be worth reaching. And it treats the grant of access, when it comes, as a signal of status elevation for the person receiving it. Machiavelli described this in the context of the prince who must move among his subjects. He advised distance, not coldness, distinction. The prince who is everywhere taken for granted. The prince who appears selectively is anticipated, prepared for, received with an attention that the permanently available man never experiences. The second pillar is consistency of standards. The man who is never disrespected does not have different rules for different people. He does not apply his standards selectively based on who has power over him and who doesn't. This consistency does something specific to the social environment around him. It removes uncertainty. Every person who interacts with him learns quickly that there is one operating system. It never changes, and it applies regardless of who you are. That predictability is not boring. It is powerful because it means that the man's standards are not performances for the benefit of specific audiences. They are structural features of who he is. You cannot flatter your way past them. You cannot apply pressure to suspend them. He does not threaten. He does not announce what will happen if a boundary is crossed. He has simply made it observable over time through repeated demonstration that crossing his boundaries produces consequences reliably, without exception, without the emotional charge that would make the consequence seem like a reaction rather than a policy. This is the architecture of deterrence. Not fear exactly, certainty. The social brain distinguishes between the man who might react badly and the man who will respond predictably. The first is a gamble. The second is a calculation. And calculations about clearly negative outcomes are not made repeatedly. They're made once, filed, and avoided. The fourth pillar is zero tolerance as policy, not emotion. This is where most men get it wrong. They tolerate disrespect situationally. When they are tired, when the stakes feel too high for a confrontation, when they tell themselves it isn't worth it. And then when their threshold is finally crossed, they respond emotionally, with anger, with visible upset, with the unmistakable signal that the disrespect reached them deeply enough to destabilize them. That response is the worst possible outcome, because it tells the room 2 things simultaneously: that you've been absorbing disrespect until now, and that it affects you when you finally react. It confirms the social test results from every previous interaction that went unchallenged. Zero tolerance as policy means the threshold is set structurally and enforced without emotion. Early, before the stakes are high, on the small things, not the large ones. The man who addresses the first disrespect quietly, calmly, immediately, not from anger but from policy, never has to address the 10th. Because the 10th never comes. Machiavelli, in his sharpest passage on this subject, wrote that men in general will love you on their terms and fear you on yours. The man who makes loving him irrelevant and fearing him unnecessary, who has built conditions under which the social calculation of disrespecting him simply doesn't make sense, that man has escaped the entire game. He has made disrespect structurally irrational, not unthinkable, because he is powerful enough to crush anyone who tries. Unthinkable because the architecture is so precisely built, so consistently maintained, so reliably enforced that the social brain of every person who interacts with him reaches the same conclusion before the thought fully forms. Not here. Not this one. The man who commands respect doesn't demand it. He has engineered the conditions under which it is the only rational option. Return to the beginning. 39 milliseconds. That verdict is still firing in every room you enter. The brain across from you is still running its ancient, unsentimental neurological process, assembling its evaluation from visual data before you have opened your mouth, building its filing system about who you are, what you are worth, and whether you can be tested. Most men spend their lives hoping that verdict will eventually get it right. They invest in their credentials, their work, their character, and they wait for the room to catch up to the truth of who they are. They're still waiting. The man who commands respect has understood something that the merely talented will never accept. The room does not discover who you are. It reads what you project, and what you project, through every signal your presence emits, through the consistency of your standards, through the way you respond to challenge, and the way you structure access to yourself. That is not an accident. That is architecture. Machiavelli was not writing about princes. He was writing about the fundamental operating system of human social life, the system that governs how men assign status, calibrate deference, and decide who to test and who to leave alone. He was describing a world in which perception is not adjacent to reality, is prior to it. The perception forms first. The reality is built inside it. With the same obsessive precision that Rockefeller brought to the silence in a negotiation room and Augustus brought to the cost of the first public challenge to his authority. He builds the signal. He maintains the structure. He files the disrespect. He invoices precisely. And the room, encountering him for the first time, in the 39 milliseconds before a word is exchanged, the only question, the question Machiavelli spent his life trying to answer, is who delivered it. Them by default, or you by design.